Did you know that just 2 centuries ago, India had one of the most advanced and widespread education systems in the world? A system that wasn't just limited to a privileged few, but was inclusive, free, and deeply ingrained in the fabric of society. Education wasn't a commodity. It was a way of life, available to people across different backgrounds. But today, if you ask most people about it, they have little to no knowledge of how this system worked. Why is that? Because it was systematically dismantled. The British did not just colonize India politically or economically, they also colonized our minds. They knew that to maintain control, they had to reshape how Indians thought, learned, and viewed themselves. And so, a calculated strategy was put into motion, one that would replace a flourishing indigenous education system with a foreign model designed to serve the needs of the British Empire. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's well-documented history. Over the next few minutes, we'll break down how the British studied, dismantled, and manipulated India's education system, replacing it with a framework that prioritized obedience over critical thinking. And don't just take my word for it. We'll look at actual historical documents, reports, and policies that show exactly how this happened. This is the history they don't want you to know. So, if you're ready to uncover the truth, make sure to hit that like button and stay till the end, because this information might just change the way you see our past and our future. What was India's education like before the British? Let's take a moment to understand what the Indian education system looked like before British rule. Education in India wasn't centralized, yet it was highly organized. Every village had a school. Students weren't just learning to read and write. They were learning philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, Ayurveda, architecture, metallurgy, and even governance. Subjects weren't isolated. They were interwoven, ensuring a holistic learning experience. A British surveyor named William Adam, who was sent to study education in India, noted in his report between 1835 and 1838 that just in Bengal and Bihar alone, there were over 1 lakh schools. That's just 2 regions. Imagine how many thousands more existed across the entire subcontinent. And the most important part? Education was accessible to everyone, contrary to the popular misconception that only a few upper caste elites had access to learning. Historian Dharampal's extensive research in The Beautiful Tree reveals that village schools were largely run by local communities, funded by temple trusts, donations, and endowments. This meant education was free, without the burden of costly tuition fees. Unlike today's system of rote learning, students were encouraged to ask questions and engage deeply with knowledge. They studied complex Sanskrit texts, Persian literature, and Tamil classics, mastering multiple languages along the way. One of the most striking aspects of India's pre-colonial education system was the sheer diversity of subjects taught. In Bengal alone, schools provided training in advanced arithmetic, commercial mathematics, and practical trade skills like shipbuilding, weaving, and metalwork. Many European travelers, including François Bernier in the 17th century, wrote about how Indian students could solve complex mathematical equations without modern tools. The famous Takshashila and Nalanda universities weren't just centers of Hindu or Buddhist learning, they were truly global institutions. Scholars from China, Greece, Persia, and Central Asia traveled to India to study medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and linguistics. In fact, Nalanda's library, Dharma Gunj, had over 9 million manuscripts before it was destroyed. This was a self-sustaining education system that had been thriving for centuries. So, what happened? The British plan: destroy and replace. To control a nation, you must first control how its people think, and that's exactly what the British set out to do. In 1835, a man named Lord Macaulay arrived in India with a clear agenda. He believed that Indian culture and knowledge were inferior, and that the best way to civilize Indians was to make them think like the British. Macaulay's infamous Minute on Indian Education laid out this plan in chilling detail. In his own words, he stated, "A single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia." His goal was to create a class of Indians who were as he described, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. The British were fully aware that the indigenous education system fostered independent thinking. They feared that an educated Indian population would resist colonial rule. This is evident from letters exchanged between British officials, where they openly discussed the need to create an education system that produced a docile, obedient workforce, rather than leaders. In fact, Charles Trevelyan, another British official, wrote, "The educated Indians, instead of aspiring to self-government, should feel it a privilege to serve the British Empire." This mindset shaped their policies. English education was not introduced to uplift Indians, but to ensure that they remained subservient to colonial interests. And so the British systematically withdrew funding from indigenous schools, pushing them into decline. Sanskrit schools, Gurukuls, madrasas, and pathshalas were slowly suffocated, and in their place, English medium schools were established. But these schools weren't designed to create intellectuals or leaders. Their purpose was to train clerks, obedient workers who could serve British administrative needs. By 1860, thousands of traditional schools had shut down due to a lack of funding. The British weren't just neglecting indigenous education, they were actively destroying it. Caste-based schools, divide and rule. But the British didn't stop at dismantling the education system. They also used education as a tool to divide Indian society further. The Hunter Commission of 1882 introduced caste-based funding for schools. Upper caste schools received better funding and resources, while lower caste and tribal schools were neglected. The result? A widening gap in literacy and opportunities. The 1904 Education Act further reinforced this divide by prioritizing elite schools in major cities while ignoring village education. This ensured that the ruling class continued to benefit while common Indians remained uneducated and dependent. The long-term effects of these policies were devastating. Literacy rates among marginalized communities plummeted, and opportunities for social mobility were lost. The rich-poor divide widened, and generations of Indians were left with limited access to knowledge. Education, which had once been an equalizing force, was now a weapon of division. The final blow. The Indian University Act, 1857. In 1857, the British set up universities in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. On the surface, this might seem like a positive development, but there was a catch. These universities were not meant for common Indians. They weren't created to produce scientists, innovators, or philosophers. Instead, they were designed to train English-speaking clerks who could serve in British offices. The curriculum was strictly controlled, with an emphasis on British literature, European history, and Western philosophy. Indian knowledge systems were dismissed as irrelevant, and students were discouraged from studying their own heritage. By the time the British left India in 1947, the damage had been done. Our literacy rate had dropped to just 12%, one of the lowest in the world. A country that had once been a leader in education was now struggling to educate its own people. Was this a coincidence? Or was it part of a larger strategy? This wasn't an accident. It was a carefully planned effort to keep India dependent and divided. An educated population is an empowered population, and by stripping India of its traditional education systems, the British ensured that generations of Indians would grow up disconnected from their own intellectual and cultural heritage. But history is not just about the past, it's about the present and the future. Today, we have the opportunity to reclaim what was lost. We can start by educating ourselves about our true history. We can promote Indian knowledge systems, encourage holistic learning, and work towards an education model that values critical thinking over memorization. It's time to take back control of our narrative. Education is power, and the more we understand our past, the better equipped we are to shape our future. If this video opened your eyes to something new, hit the like button, share this with your friends, and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Together, let's bring back the legacy of learning that once made India a global center of knowledge.